Oh, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today. We are going to be looking at Lesson 8 of the OSU PDC Pro assignment. And yeah, we have a little bit to cover. We're starting to get near the end of the course and getting into more design-related exercises rather than our previous well, much of the previous course has really been about site analysis. So let me just share my screen here. There we go. So we are at lesson 8. And yeah, now we get into some really fun stuff. Mind you, it's all been enjoyable, I'm sure. But when we get into plants, most people really start to get excited about the design end of things here. So in lesson 8, we have two different components here. We have a local plant survey, which is worth 4 points, and we have the plant system design, which is worth 14. So as you can see, we have a greater emphasis on the second half of this lesson, and I would encourage you to if you're a little bit tight for time here, you definitely want to make sure you're really well focused on the second part of this lesson. So let us take a look at the first part. So the local plant survey. So this is pretty straightforward. We're just going to look at some local plants, as the name indicates, and basically use the template file here, which I will bring up. Let's go back to our local plant survey. So we want to put at least 3 plants in here. You can do more if you wish. And this is a very interesting exercise because you get to go through and you end up learning a little bit more about plants in your area. Whether they're medicinal or naturalized, native, uh, not to worry, whatever you choose to select here. But it's great when we get into the properties of these, the parts that are used, and common use, personal use, all these little, you know, elements within the spreadsheet that make this up. So I find it very, very interesting to, it's continual. Um, well, we're basically continually learning about all of the resources around us, and this is one of those exercises that really does help show that. So the next part of the exercise, we're looking at traditional seasonal foods. And we look at each season, of course, and listing a plant here that's edible within that season. Then we look at local nurseries that are in your area and local farms. So, this first section of lesson 8 is pretty straightforward. And then, of course, we have a SWOT analysis and any questions or feedback that you wish to add to that. So I'm not sure if anybody has any questions about that. It is pretty
I do
straightforward.
have a couple of questions.
Cool.
How large of an area are we surveying for the these plants? And
Well,
is it
would be
just the site, or should we be like taking the greater, like, I don't know, county that we're in, or like where is it that we should be?
well, that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever had that one before. So local, to me, I would start with your project site and move out from that. Okay, so if for whatever reason there's not a lot of variety or diversity on your project site, certainly move outside those boundaries. And with local, I would, personally look at the the area in which you're living in. So if it was Portland, try and stick there. If wherever that might be, you should be able to easily come up with, 3 to 5 plants, even on your project site. But yeah, whatever it takes. I know yours, Limon, your site's a bit unique in that it's an active educational facility. So in your situation, you may not have the diversity that a lot of other people have. So please feel free to go beyond your project site boundary if you wish. And yeah, if you can stay in your general location, I think that would be best.
And then what for the nurseries, are we looking for like native plant nurseries or are you looking for just any nursery?
I would say it would be any nursery that's going to have medicinal or native plants. Yeah, these are just we don't get that specific with the instructions here. Um, and pretty much most retail nurseries are going to cover, at least where I live, you're going to have at least a fraction of native and medicinals available. And of course, then you're going to find the occasional specialty nursery, which really does dial into that. So yeah. So again, we want to know the location and the distance from your project site. Yeah. So hopefully you have farms and nurseries nearby. And if not, that is actually something that we look at when we get to that SWOT analysis. So if your local farms are a long way away, well, that may actually end up being a weakness that you observe. Yeah. So I hope that
All
helps
right,
you
thank
out.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem at all. So that's a little bit about the local plant survey. And again, they can be native or naturalized. And there's some good information here on the discussion board. As well, we have some student examples. I can just quickly, if I just have to find where this starts. We're getting there. There we go. So that's our local plant survey. So this person did 4 that were probably in and around their project site. And then the edible, that's always very interesting as well, season by season, going through these. And then here, so this is on Vancouver Island, and I know this area. So this is where the project site was, and you can see to list, say, 5 nurseries, this person had to go a bit outside of their local area onto Denman Island here. And the same with the farm. Now, reality is this is an agricultural hub, and I'm sure they would have no problem finding lots more farms locally there. But yeah, and then the SWOT analysis, of course. And there were questions and feedback on that page. So again, this should be a fairly straightforward exercise. There are some resources here, but I think a lot of these are relating to plant resources. So if nothing else, there's a couple of links here that are really useful takeaways when the course ends and you're looking for good resources. Um, Plants for a Future database. I use that quite a bit, and it's quite an amazing database. A lot of plants that you would not even imagine that have medicinal um, attributes to them. You can find in here, and let me just quickly go here. I should put in an example. You just have a search at the top. Well, let's try Douglas fir. So then this is your search result, and get a wonderful description, hardiness, family, habitats, and then you get an edibility rating. Now, who would have known that
Two to
Douglas
five.
fir A 2 out of 5. Yeah, that's
Doesn't sound
probably,
like it's very tasty.
yeah, it's probably a 1 out of 5. And then it has a medicinal rating too. So I know personally I've had Douglas fir tea before. It's really interesting tea with the from the new shoots. It's great if you're getting a cold or feeling a little run down. It's a real good shot of vitamin C. And then they have the summary and physical characteristics here. And then they get into the edible uses, so as well as medicinal uses. So it's a really valuable resource that I use quite a bit. The other one here that is very good too is the Natural Capital Database, and everybody has access to that right now. I'm not sure when that changes after the course, but this is certainly if you're wanting to build your plant knowledge, this is a really good way of doing it. It's just having a great database that you can pull on when you're trying to access more information about plants that you wish to use. So there's a couple of good resources there. Again, we have our rubric. So for the first part of the exercise, it's quite straightforward. So the second half of this is a little more exciting in that we're actually going to get into some planting design. And here we're calling it a plant system design. So what we're trying to do with this exercise is just take a small section of your project site where you intend to build some soft landscapes and plantings, and preferably where there is some existing plants that you can use as sort of the foundation. So it may not have that. So you may have uh, there has been on occasion, or somebody would have a project site that's an urban site that's say been cleared and is ready to build on, so it would have absolutely nothing. And in that situation, you'd want to add in some here. So as you can see with the instructions, you want to add at least two plants that have similar structure. And they don't have to be the exact same species or the same plant itself, but just similar structure. And often that's a canopy type plant. So one of those layers that are going to be higher in your landscape, really depending on the site. And even if it was in a small bed that you couldn't put fruit trees in, that looking at that shrub herbaceous climbing ground cover layer would be a good alternative to that. So I think one of the things, the great takeaways on this exercise is just getting used to or considering the various layers within the landscape, within the soft landscape. So often you'll see plantings of we see that a lot where I live, especially in commercial um, landscapes where there might be a bed that was just shrubs or just trees or just herbaceous perennials. And what we want to kind of instill is the benefits of looking at multiple layers within your landscape. Um, what I have found, I mean, it's for myself, it's always been the way that I've moved forward with plant design. And I'm not really sure why. I had mentors really early in my life that I guess instilled this in me. But what ends up happening, well, our observation is if you have a given area, let me get you an example here. Just taking a look at, okay. give me 2 seconds here. We'll find an example that sort of covers that off. Sorry for the delay here. I should have had that image pulled out. Oh, there we go. I'll find something here. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm just going to switch what I'm sharing just briefly here, just to give you an example. So here's the landscape we did. Sadly, when I count the years, it was about 20 years ago. And this was a large organic farm, and they wanted to have probably a 2 acre, may have been 3 acres within it that was almost park-like, but um, it had to go with the rest of the surrounding area. And this was part of their fields up in the background here. So regardless of the theme, regardless of what we're trying to do here, one of the things that we follow and that you might want to consider here is these multiple layers within the soft landscape. So up here we have a tree canopy, and this is only a year after planting, so we don't have to wait too long for good results. We had a tree layer, we have shrub layers, we had some very tall grasses in here, and a lot of herbaceous perennials and climbers as well that are probably not easy to see here, as well as some ground cover layer as well. And so advantage is this diversity attracts a lot of insects and birds and creates a lot of desirable habitat for a wide variety of organisms. It also helps you control the ground, because when you go to plant a prepared area, you have a blank slate. And if you plant it in such a way where you're dictating what is going on within that landscape, the maintenance, the follow-up is going to be much easier. And in this case, you can see there's very little opportunity for weeds to get a hold on this landscape. They just don't have the light and the space, because we've already kind of dictated what's going on here. So that is, in essence, kind of what we're after with this exercise. We want, as best as you can, we want to see different layers within the plantings and how they interrelate to one another. When this was put together, it was really all about aesthetic. This was years and years ago, before I'd even heard about permaculture. And but we inherently wanted to improve ecological function and do it in a way where there was no herbicides or synthetic fertilizers used. It was all about building the landscape in a holistic manner and maintaining it that way. So we'll go back to our exercise here. Yeah, so one thing I would consider doing is, when you are working on this assignment, just take a small chunk of your landscape. So that the picture I had just shown you was quite a big area. You could take a very small section of that for this exercise. And that's what I would recommend. Just, shrink it down a little bit so that it's not too overwhelming. And just play with it a bit. And if I was to show you some of my early plantings, I'm sure everybody would have quite a good laugh in that. When I was first know, even before I was an apprentice, I just did not know what was going to work and what wouldn't. And it's a lot of what I did in my early years was trial and error. So it's nice uh, in this exercise, we can do it on a small scale on paper, and then you know you can consider it. I can provide you guys with some feedback, um, and then if you want, you can go and execute it on your own project site or try it in your own landscape. But the tricky part with all of this is when you go and plant something, you have to wait and for your observations, right? So it can often take at least, it might take a year for after planting to go and take a look and see how things responded. And if you, part of the reason the we had really good response in that last image was we picked plants that would do well in that setting, but the big part of that was actually the preparation and ensuring that our soils were, optimized before plants went in the ground. And then we had some high quality compost that followed up. So it's all about cultivating the soil and getting that right combination of plants. And again, that previous image was pretty much an aesthetic based planting, and for some people they wouldn't like that at all. And for others, I really enjoy it. Would I do the exact same thing today? Probably not. Um, Probably do it a little bit differently. So that tends to be what happens. You change your approach a little bit. Uh, let's see here if we've got any more
Can
things.
can you, the two trees that you are choosing, or
Hmm.
can they already be existing in your landscape? Or
Sure.
um, it looks like they were saying like one of them could be or something, but
If you
can they
have a
both
couple,
be? Or
yeah, sure, Lamont, that's a good question. And if you had a couple of existing trees within your landscape that are, fairly close to one another, I would certainly use those as a great foundation to build on, right?
okay,
So if they're hundreds of feet apart, maybe just select one and try and create a guild or a complementary planting in and around that. So that's sort of how I would approach it. And if there isn't any tree at all there, because I know you have a pretty big space to work with, so you definitely want to try and build in that tree shrub herbaceous and climbing element, as well as ground cover. Consider those. Now, the exception to that would be if you had a very narrow planting area. So that last image was quite deep, and that's way back. I used to build these enormous planting areas so we could do a lot with them. We could put a lot of diversity and a lot of different layers and a lot of, cover a lot of the season. So if you're planting in an area that, let's say it was 4 feet deep, because that's kind of a minimum planting width that we try and adhere to. Anything smaller seems to be a real struggle. But if it was 4 feet deep, it does quite limit what you can do in that space, even if it's quite long. So trees may not work there at all. You may want to just go with a shrub and underplantings in that
uh,
situation.
the space I was thinking of choosing is it's about 8 feet deep, and I was
Mhm.
thinking of, but it's long. It's probably 100 and some 20 feet long or so.
Right.
I was thinking of putting like an espalier apple
Oh,
row
nice.
to create like a living fence.
Wow, that'd be lovely. Yeah, that sounds great. If just as a word of advice for this exercise, you might just want to take, 20, 30, 40 feet of that as your assignment. And then as we get into that zone one or the final design, you can sort of expand on it. I mean, you can do whatever you want. You could fully do a planting plan for that now. But if you're trying, well, if you wish to um, sort of zoom in on a specific space, feel free to do so. Yeah. So that's a nice sized bed for
Okay.
sure. And the only thing with that, okay, that brings up another question, and it is something that we allude to here is access. So just consider access for maintenance and for harvest. Yeah, and that's where that previous image that was just an aesthetic landscape. If that was an edible landscape, we would have to have, planned a little bit differently and allowed some movement into the landscape by people off the pathway for harvest and or for any pruning and stuff. So, because typically, I can just go back to that briefly.
Yeah, I was planning to kind of plan in some stepping stones, but
Oh, good idea. Okay. And you can see here we have access through pathway, but nothing visible going into the bed here. And in a large part, this sort of a planting uh, got a real, well, focused bit of maintenance early in the year, sort of January, February, where all this material would get cut down and then it would be mulched. And then basically that's it. You don't have to go back. If anything was large and needed division, that's the time to do it. But the rest of the year, we did not encourage people to jump into the garden there. But again, if it's a edible landscape, it's very different. So stepstones are a great idea, and you can still, look at the various layers within that, just allowing yourself to get in and out of that, the back of that area to attend to your apples. Um, let's see, where was I going with this? Yeah, so there's some good notes here on things to consider. So the ecological service, the primary species provides, the function, what yields are there, and I would also say a yield can come in multiple. You can get a physical harvest. You may look at something and just think it's beautiful. We have a lot of plants in my landscape at home here where we'll allow like we grow a lot of kale, and over winter that's a big part of our food. The squash and kale and cabbage and all the brassicas are a big part of our winter diet. And then we let them flower in the spring, and that yield is for all the honeybees and native bees. And we take it almost to the extreme where we let them finish flowering before we go down and cut them down and replant. So again, that yield can have all sorts of different there can be all sorts of different types of yields. So why have you placed each plant in this chosen position? Honestly, if I had to answer that, that would be really difficult. When I typically plant, it'll be more by feeling, which sounds really odd, but it's how that whole space feels. Now you can, simplify that quite a bit. So say with your espalier apple, living fence, that's pretty obvious why you would put that there. And then any other plants you have in that area would be supporting it. And effective management of ensure adequate space. Now that is a really important piece. And that's something that we've always been really mindful of. Whenever we do tree and shrub plantings, we are looking at allowing space for those over their lifetime. And so one thing I do not like to see is shrubs pruned back hard, just for the sake of it. If you're in there pruning for production, then that is wonderful. That's a great approach. Um, but if it's conflicting with a neighboring plant and you're just trying to hammer it back to give it space, that's less desirable in my opinion. Um, let's see here. Yeah, so you want to give it enough space, gets full grown. The exception to that, I would say, is when we get into herbaceous perennials. So they tend to grow much faster. And where I am in southern BC, you could plant a 1 gallon herbaceous perennial and perhaps in 3 or 4 years you're going to have to lift it and divide it because it would have gotten so large by then. Not all of them, but some. So that's an exception in that you really, you want to occupy the ground and realize that some of these underplantings will get larger and need some division over time, which means you have more plants to play with later, which is wonderful. Design by subtraction. So that's an interesting approach. Often when we are doing planting plans, I'll switch back to this as, actually I'll switch to another example here. Let's just go through. This is a design we did and executed. Just trying to get an example. Here's a reasonable example. So ignore the red dot. I'm not sure why that's there. Get rid of that maybe if we can. No. Okay. Anyway, it's just a planting plan. It's really not critical what these are. They are up here if you want to know that. And this is the labeling system we use. It's all part of the software we have. But if you look, the size of the symbols are a good indicator of the mature size of these trees and the shrubs. And then you'll notice that we have some herbaceous plants sort of tucked in to these awkward spaces that occur when we start placing our trees and shrubs. So that's kind of how we approach our planting plan. We'll work from the largest material downward. And if we had our trees and our shrubs placed here, you can see there's spaces back here that if we don't plan for, we're going to have a response. No doubt something we don't want in there. So we look at all these little spaces and we didn't plant there, but that's something to consider. Yeah, you really want to try and dominate the ground. And clumping. There's a lot of different ways to lay out plants. Sometimes we'll clump things together in different groups. Other times you can drift them. So there's a lot of really interesting variety on how you can do that. Curvilinear rows and layering by height. That is a biggie. That is, in my mind, very, very important. Not only aesthetically, but just ecologically. And a solar bowl. So you may end up discovering one of the areas you're planting as quite the nice little microclimate, and you plant it accordingly. We have a very interesting project going on right now, and I'll see if I have any images of it here. At home, our project for the first time in quite a long time. We are renovating our own landscape. I don't know if I have pictures on the computer here. I may not. Okay, I'll just forward one or two. And the reason I'm mentioning that is one of the things we're doing is creating a unique planting with a microclimate. Because there's a microclimate there, I'll just forward. Sorry for the delay here. Never know entirely what you're going to talk about. Well, my picture should be getting transferred here, hopefully soon. That is unusual. Yeah, sorry for the delay here. Try that one more time. Aha, sounded like it worked. All right. Yeah, and the reason, again, I'm going to show you this is like kind of plays into what we were talking about. So this, about 20 years ago, we built a pond in this location, and it wasn't very deep, and it served us well and our ecology well for years, and it was time to do something different here. So we were actually going to create an irrigation pond, and we were hoping to get about 50 or 60,000 gallons of storage here. And it became apparent that with our test digging, that we were into some really hard ground and did not feel like, bringing in a larger machine and battling this. As well, this is right close to our house, about 20 feet away from our house. And I had a bit of an issue with the aesthetic end of having an irrigation pond so close, because an irrigation pond can be pretty ugly during the growing season. You're basically just going to see liner down the side, and you've got a body of water that doesn't have really good biology. So what we thought we would do is just uphill from this, we have a ditch running along the top of our property, and we have all the downspouts on our house all plumbed and piped. And so we thought we would send it into this landscape. And what we ended up doing, we created an excavation. So we almost did a giant rain garden of sorts. So this bottom layer is zone one of the lands of zone one of a rain garden. So this will get flooded, and the overflow height is right at the top of that catch basin. And then zone two, which is the next layer or the next step up on this. As you can see, and my wife's getting tired here and not thrilled that I'm taking a photo of her. But this is where we're putting a lot of edible plants up in this area. So they're going to be able to tap in to some of that water, because this ditch that we're diverting is very active. And hold on here, I've got a picture of the finish. go. Got some more to look at. Just to give you a bit of context here. There we go. Hold on. That is the wrong one. Aha, no, it doesn't. So this is where we are extracting the water. We have a ditch over here on the other side of our road. So we've run some piping here, and we have run piping from our parking area. And you can see there's really hard pan right in here. It's very close to the. So we're heading towards that infiltration basin, and it's not complete yet. But basically, we daylight the pipes here, and there's going to be this wide swale leading down to this infiltration area. So it should be very interesting how this turns out. We're going to be planting that bottom zone this week, the zone 1 of we'll call it a rain garden. And yeah, it should be, again, very interesting. I'll keep you updated next week on how it looks, but it looks a bit rough right now, but we're just doing all we can. Well, we did all we could with that excavator until the weather started turning on us, which is pretty much today. It started to move, get much cooler and wet, but yeah, a little snapshot on what's going on our end here. Let me go back to our assignment. Let's see here. So some of the elements. So we want to see the existing conditions. So what does that mean? Well, that is really on this slide here. We want to see the plan view. You're basically your base plan. So what does the site look like? Your statement of purpose and the goals. What are you trying to achieve here? And again, this plant system design can be quite a small area. The next sheet, we're looking at the proposed plan. So what are you proposing? And often this is a good opportunity where you could use a grayed out base plan and put your new plantings and have those colorized, right? So they'll be very, very obvious what you're trying to do here. And that, again, is a suggestion that's been made. And then we really stretch it. We want you to provide a little cross section. And that's very useful because that's going to show us and yourself as you're doing this, those different layers within that planting, how those get covered and whether there may be some space that you could improve on. Perhaps you have a tree and shrub planting and nothing else. And, that's a good opportunity, and the cross section will sort of bring that to your focus, that may be something that you want to consider, is covering that lower level or lower layer within the landscape. So you would put that here. And then we want a little bit of information on the plants that you've placed within that exercise. And let me see here. Plant system design, plants species matrix, and then we're looking at the function of those. And then, of course, this interrelationship. This is all about maintaining that landscape, because that is a consideration when you're designing. There's no doubt of that. And that takes a little bit of time to fully grasp. Um, but it's good to consider early in the works. And of course, water and irrigation. How is that going to be maintained? So another important thing to consider. And then we have our SWOT analysis. So there may be items that come up in your mind. Um, for instance, let's say your plant system design has a beautiful existing apple tree. Well, that is certainly something that would be a strength within your SWOT analysis. Perhaps you don't have any significant plants, and that could be seen as a weakness at this stage. Um, there's a couple ways of looking at it. Often, empty pallets I see as opportunity, and sometimes it's often harder to work around existing plant material. But yeah, so you got a couple of different choices there. And And then again, take a look at the rubric because this is what I use when I grade any assignments. So we want to make sure we have all these elements within your work, and that way you can get your full points. Okay. Now let me see what resources. I think we've kind of covered off those resources pretty good. Does anybody have any questions about the plant system design?
I do in the fact that like on the base plan, are we creating a new base plan for like that close-up area? Or are we expected to use our other base plan?
No, that's a very good question. I guess some of that would depend on, the format of your base plan. Um, if it was myself doing this, and let's see what one of the examples are here. We'll see what this fellow did. So in this example, this student took just a section of his base plan. Now, if you can see here, he has included the whole base plan and then indicated what section of that is going to be part of this exercise. So that's an ideal way of doing it. So we have a very good idea within your project site where it's located, and even a photograph is helpful. So that's how I would approach it, is just zoom in or crop that place, that area that you're hoping to develop.
My plan is so large that I will have to create a new one because it's such a small, like I
Yeah,
can't get it to that close-up look.
sure, I get it. There's a few students in the current course that just started that have over 100 acres
Oh,
as a
wow.
project. Yeah, so you can imagine you're trying to do this. So the same thing, you have to really just zoom in and focus on a small area. And not to say, if you do that and you're very happy with that, that can easily get replicated out. In your example, that's a good case. Maybe you do a 15-foot example of what you're hoping, and then you could almost duplicate that at some
Right.
level for the rest of
That's
your,
sort of what I'm thinking of doing is kind of
yeah,
creating like a little vignette sort of thing and then just kind of making that all the way along the whole
sure.
fence because you want it to sort of look similar.
Yes, you certainly want unity. Um, I guess unity while some randomness, it's a tricky little balance, but yeah, you definitely want to nail that. Um, does anybody else have Pandora? Do you have any questions at all? Are you feeling pretty comfortable with the exercise and the space you have to work with?
Yeah, no, I don't have any questions. I see somebody else has their hand up though.
Oh, you're quite right. I am not totally sure who A is, but you go ahead,
Sorry,
A.
it's Allison. Um, Hi. So
Ah,
as I'm looking at this, I've got a few places on my property that I could do something. Um, one of them, and I know we've talked about all of my animal problems here and predators and such on my property. So we have this mature persimmon tree
mm,
that is on. So my whole backyard is a slope, but there's one part that is like too steep to feel safe mowing.
mm.
And I've considered turning that into a planting area so I don't have to.
Right.
And the persimmon is kind of at the maybe the base edge of that, and the top is a whole bunch of roses. But right now we have a fence around it to keep the deer out of the persimmons. But I'm not sure how that would translate into having a beautiful planting or a functional planting when I still have to have everything fenced.
Right. Well, that's a good question. Do you have sort of alleyways? Is what you're planning sort of alleyways with pasture, with grazing in between, or what's going on around that?
Okay, so this one is it's right kind of on the east side of the house. There's like a garden, and then there's on the other side there's roses and then this persimmon. So it's actually in the yard. Um, I am looking at doing kind of alleyways through the pastures, but that's not what this part is that I'm looking at. Um,
Okay. I'm just bringing up
I was
your file if you don't mind.
oh, not at all.
It's hard to remember everybody's projects. They're all interesting. Aha, there you go. Okay. So you have lots of open space. And let me see. Is it kind of in this area you're thinking?
So that is a row of that's the row of fruit trees that I need to figure out how to protect.
Oh, yeah.
But what
Okay.
I'm looking at is if you see the house kind of on the north side of the house,
Mm-hmm.
you can zoom in. Um,
So right in this
yeah,
area?
okay. So right there, actually, right a little bit east and south, there's a tree right there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go east from there.
All right.
Other side, keep going. Right there, that tree.
Okay.
That guy. Yeah. So that whole area, and you can kind of see the rose bushes along that line as well, kind of if you just go south from where your mouse is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that section, there's a gate that comes out of the dog run. I'd like to put like a little path. I might actually have to terrace it. It's quite steep in
Right.
some of those areas.
Right.
But it feels weird to put just a giant fence around the whole thing. I feel like anything that I plant is going to have to be deer tolerant or they're just going to devour everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know when I'm on 5 acres, and when we moved here, that was the first thing we did was deer fence the whole property.
Okay.
And if I did it again, I don't know I would do that. Might just protect half of it, but often when we look at, and I know that's not the case here, but when we look at say rows of trees and
Mm-hmm.
grazing that's been done in between, so sort of an agroforestry setup. It's then very easy to fence because you're just fencing around that row of planting. And even though it can be very, very diverse, could be, multiple different tree canopies and underplantings, but it tends to be fairly narrow. Let me just get you an example here. We'll just
And when you're fencing that close to the trees, you don't need to go like 10 feet high, do you?
that's right. That's right. So you can go much narrower. Uh, let's mark Shepherd's Place. Trying to get a good see, this is I know it's, we're labeling it keyline design here. But this is somewhat the idea. Imagine these trees, these alleys, maybe you're grazing in between these rows. And so from here to here is just where you got to have your fencing on both sides, right? And this is kind of a monocrop almost. I've seen examples of this where there's a lot of different trees, plus there's a shrub, often a berry layer beneath it. And if we could zoom in close enough, that's what we would see with Mark Shepherd's work here. Same idea. He laid out perennial crops on these rows, and perennial by I mean tree shrub primarily. And then he had annual crops and haying going on in between. So it's on a space like you've got. I'm not suggesting anything, but whenever I see an open pasture and person has animals, it's often something to consider. If you want to increase the resiliency of your property with these longer term perennial crops like nut trees, fruit trees, and yet still run animals and benefit. And as you can imagine, the animals benefit from the crops that are falling on the ground, and the trees are benefiting from all of the animal activity around them. So I'm not sure that's actually answering your question by any means, but I think part of the answer is what your plans are. So if you were just having a little area here you wanted to enhance, then you'd have to think about fencing that perimeter. If you're doing a broader planting, then again, this whole keyline thing is that's an example where you could fence each side and have the middle open. There's another. It's not a very good example, but this is getting closer to what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Just things that, there's all sorts of potential. This is another example where these are perennial crops, and then often animals, chickens, whatever, get run in between. This is, that looks like Richard Perkins area. So this is a newly planted area in Sweden. Same idea, trees and shrubs, and then animals are grazed in between these rows. And with keyline, you'll notice there's even spaces between the rows to make it easy for doing so. And rather than having them on contour where your rows are going to fluctuate and could make it a little bit trickier for grazing. So yeah, that's, I'm not sure if I really helping you on that, Allison, but yeah, I would actually just move forward and do your what you have in mind around here without worrying too much about the fencing right now. And you may, honestly, you may find that even at the end of this course, you have your design in place. It can change pretty significantly between the design and the implementation. You may discover that you want to change things up a lot. I mean, I've been living on property I'm at for 25 years, and we've probably had 6 major changes in our landscape. So it's one of the curses of seeing different things on your property and being able to execute it. So, yeah, you have a lot of potential here. So it'll be very interesting to see what how this works out for you. Yeah, you got 5 acres. There you go.
Yeah. So I do have one other question about
Sure.
pond things. So our pond is filled with irrigation water. It like comes in and it overflows into the next property.
Right.
So when they turn the irrigation off, there's nothing filling it, and we have 2 willows, one on either side there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming what's happening, we've got sandy soil and we've got willows, so our pond is almost completely dry by this point. And I would like to keep more water in there. I've considered lining it, but the willows do need the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum that way,
And
isn't it?
I don't want to kill them off.
Yeah. What kind of soils do you have without me running and
So
finding?
it said it's the clay, but what in my test everything came back quite sandy.
Okay. So there's a few things. If you want to seal this up, you could look at a product called bentonite.
Mm-hmm.
It is very specific. It'll help in specific situations.
Okay.
If you can get a geotextile that has this bentonite embedded into it, and it can really help seal areas. Um, if this is quite sandy, lining it may, now you could also line it with clay. If there is some activities going on in your area, let's say there's some building going on, there may be some nice clay available. I know
Okay.
I have a friend not too far from me, and he has beautiful clay. And if he ever was excavating a significant amount, there would be that availability where you could put, you have to have a really good operator to pull this off, but basically you'd have to, drain this out and excavate it down a little bit, and then you'd apply high quality clay in there, and probably about a meter or about 3 feet in thickness. And then you would seal that up, um, and you'd still get some water leaking through it a little bit. But the reality is, if you go to use any of those products and you have trees nearby, they are going to create challenges for doing that. So
Okay.
the willows are going to search it out and find it. Um,
Okay.
so that's a little bit of a tricky situation. Looks like you could easily collect off your house and off of the this hard surface here too.
Yeah, I'd like to get something set up for that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so lining it may be a reality. And that would definitely be a summertime project, having somebody excavate, clean it up, get a liner in there, and then make sure you have supply lines coming in on top of the liner. But it's tricky, when you get into that scale, it can be a little bit tricky making sure you execute it right. But you may have somebody in your area that, is really good with ponds and dugouts. So you might want to even look around at local farms and see what they're doing, right?
Yeah, I'll have to do that.
Um, but yeah, sealing up ponds, there's a few ways of doing that, but And you're saying that it holds water pretty good, but it'll just draw it right down during the summer typically?
Well, so in the summer, well, at least we've only been on the property since July, so
Okay,
hard to tell for sure. But when
right.
the irrigation is on, it just flows in and it fills up and it keeps going and it's just on continuously
Mm,
until they turn it off.
I see.
So it has a constant influx of water.
Hmm.
And then it doesn't, and then it dries up.
Yeah. Yeah, and that hmm. Yeah, so part of that is the supply issue then. Is that correct? It's just you're not in control of the supply. Is that
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately, we're not.
well, you never know. I don't have your topographic info here. I'm not sure if that was part of your oh yeah. So you do have some other flat areas, flattish. You never know, you
Mm-hmm.
may want to leave this and even consider a smaller pond as well.
Okay.
Because you're able to draw water out of this until,
Yeah, as
well,
long as the irrigation is turned on, then we're pulling water out of that to, you know, going through the sprinklers and pumping that out onto the fields and everything.
mhm. Yeah, well, the water layer is the driving force in all designs. And I would, I would give that a lot of thought, what you're trying to achieve with this. So are you hoping to store enough water for your irrigation needs? Do you want it just for fire suppression? You know,
Ideally for irrigation would be great.
so and what are you trying to irrigate? Just these uh, plantings in and around the house, or are you trying to irrigate your pasture?
So right now it's just the stuff around the house, but if I'm putting trees out through the pasture, I'd need to be able to irrigate those as well.
Yeah, so that's where um, you can do some simple calculations, right? If you took this area right here,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little less than half of your property, and if you took that, here I can quickly do that. I'm going to have to wrap up our meeting here shortly. Let's say I've got my calculator open. Let's say that's a hectare. So that's 1 hectare, 2.5 acres. Sorry, no, that's your whole. So let's say it's an acre. So it's around 45,000 square feet.
Well, I've got 5 acres, so that's probably closer to the hectare.
Sorry, yeah. Uh, okay, if we do 1 hectare, that's 10,000 square meters. And if we applied an inch of water to that, that's 250,000 liters or about 66,000 gallons. I think I did a miscalculation there. It seems a bit much. Okay. No, it was not too much. So that's how much water you would need to irrigate this whole area with 1 inch of water.
It's a lot of water.
Yes. So it's not realistic. But what is realistic is boosting the organic content and improving the soil in this area so that when it does rain, it's going to act more like a sponge and hold onto that water. So if you took 1 acre, which is 1/5 of this whole property, and you increased the water holding capacity, if you just increased 1% organic matter in the soil, that's not a lot. You're going to get an extra 20,000 gallons of storage within the soil itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So the images I showed you of the project we're doing with this huge rain garden or infiltration trench, it's all about benefiting plants that are downhill from it that you couldn't see in what I was showing you. But that is the sort of thing you'd want to try and no, not a rain garden, but the whole idea would be to try and slow water as it's moving through your site. So more water holding capacity. You could get like a keyline plow, right? And have that help you in your goal of improving the pasture. But that would be far bigger bang for your buck, spending some resources on improving the pasture versus trying to get more water to irrigate it. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
It'd be great to irrigate all this. But the reality is, we do get quite a bit of Medford. Yeah, you're dry there. Well, dry compared to where I live. I get probably twice
Yeah.
the annual average rainfall, but that just shows you how much, how precious it is, and doing all the work you can to improve the soils here. So that would be my advice to you, without knowing much about your site.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Well, we're at 1/4 after. Does anybody have anything else they want to throw out for today, or are we all good, or? Okay. Well, that sounds great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me today. It was a pleasure reviewing this with you and answering some of your questions. And one thing I did not do during the recording is just check on whether there was any questions on the Google document. No, there wasn't. Okay. Yeah, thank you again for participating today, and really look forward to seeing your assignments next week. And yeah, you take care and have a great week, everybody.